In this video, I'm going to teach you what I believe to be one of the best gambits in chess, and this is the Scotch Gambit. So let me show you the beginning move. So after e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, d4, e takes d4. This is the Scotch game, but instead of capturing the pawn on d4, we play this move, bishop to c4. And now this right here is the beginning of the Scotch Gambit opening. And idea number one in this opening is going to be whenever your opponents play knight to f6, this is the main move in the position. There are sidelines and we will look at those, but whenever they play knight f6, you want to attack this knight with this move, pawn to e5. There are some options. You can castle as well. There are some other things you can do. You can gambit this pawn, for example, and then go rook e1. There's d5 and play goes on like this. However, the main move and the most testing move is this move, pawn to e5. Now there are a couple of options that black has. Firstly, let's look at some sidelines. Let's look at moves that are not so good. For example, knight to g8. This is a very passive move, and whenever they move the knight back, what you have to remember is that you will castle, you will bring the rook to the e file, and then you will win your pawn back. And the benefit of this pawn being on e5 is that your opponent cannot play either d6 or, well, f6 is like never played in these systems, but they can never play d6 or d5 without you being able to capture either on d6 or being able to capture en passant. Now what this means is that after you capture en passant in a lot of these positions, you will open up the e file, and this is where you are going to get your compensation on the open e file, because black is still at least 3 moves away from development, and that's really tough. So for example, if bishop takes on d6, which looks very natural, you will go rook to e1 check. Say black plays knight to e7, looks very natural again, right? Blocking the check with the knight. All of a sudden you're attacking this pawn on f7. Black castles, now you have queen h5, threatening f7 and also threatening checkmate on h7. So h6 has to be played, checkmate has to be defended, of course, knight f7, and now this is a devastating attack for white. So this pawn on e5, the strategic benefit of this pawn being on e5 is that these two pawns cannot move forward without you being able to capture them and open up the e file. And even if some other moves are played, for example, in this position knight to g4 is played, let's say, you just castle, and similarly after d6 you will capture, and then you will go rook to e1 check, and we get a very similar situation in this case. King to f8 can be played, it actually should be played, and then play goes on from here. This is still a playable position, but it's very uncomfortable since black already played his king to f8. So this is still a theoretical line, and play continues on from here. It's still a game, but the king being on f8, in my opinion, I would prefer to have white in these positions. As black, you're just gonna have to be defending. Now going back, there's also another option, which is knight to e4, and if knight to e4 is played, in this case you go queen to e2. There are multiple moves once again, but queen e2 is the most testing one. And now you're attacking this knight. Knight has to move, and then you challenge this pawn on c3. And black really doesn't have any good options here. For example, you cannot just ignore this pawn, since if you go bishop to e7, c takes d4, this comes with a tempo, and all of a sudden you got these two very powerful pawns. d5 is a fork here, and if you go somewhere else, I mean, d5 can still be played with very devastating effects. This is extremely uncomfortable for black, and definitely not what black wants to do. Taking is also favorable for white since you recapture back, and even though this is somewhat playable, you get a lot of activity here with the white pieces. You're actually going to castle queenside, and once again all of your pieces are developed except this rook, which will be developed like once you start a pawn storm on this side of the board right here. So this is a very dangerous position for black, and white is clearly better here. So these are all sort of the sidelines I wanted to show you. There are some more things there, but I'm not gonna get into too much depth. The most common response to e5 is to counterattack with this move d5. This is what I face most commonly, and this is the best response. Now in situations like these, you don't want to take the knight because you lose your bishop, and and you don't really get anything, these two pawns are actually quite good. If you castle here, for example, there's queen takes f6, rook e1, and you just don't get anything after bishop to e6. Everything is very well protected for black, and these two pawns are monstrously strong. If you're not able to win this pawn on d4, then there's just going to be so much control for the black pieces. You cannot develop the knight to c3. You don't really have a lot of good options. You have to go to d2 and then e4, and it's just very uncomfortable for white. So you don't want to take this knight, and whenever your opponents counterattack with d5, you just want to move this bishop over to the b5 square. And this is a very common pattern that's going to happen in a couple of different move orders. Whenever you attack the knight on f6 with e5, you're going to get counterattacked with d5, and then you're going to move the bishop to b5. So this three move sequence happens quite frequently. And after bishop to b5, the knight has to move. Let's say knight moves to e4, you're going to capture, and now bishop d7 is the most commonly played move. And in a situation like this, you want to keep this very strong knight. But the general gist of the opening, I'm going to talk about all of the other ideas momentarily, but the first and the main idea is that you want to make black's position feel very uncomfortable by pushing this pawn to e5 whenever they play knight to f6. Once again, this comes with a tempo, and the strategic benefit of this pawn is that black cannot make any pawn breaks, black cannot create any pawn breaks without opening up the e-file, which would be beneficial for white. So you're gonna get counterattacked, and you're gonna go here, and this is how the play is going to continue. Idea number 2 is going to be to play f3 and f4 in 2 moves, and you're gonna see what I mean in a second. So in a lot of lines, after you play e5, opponent plays d5, and as we talked about, we already looked at this sequence of moves. After bishop to d7, we capture here on c6, and we get this type of a position, and we castle here, and black also develops his bishop. So this is something that you're going to see very often, and you have to remember, in situations like these, you play this clever little resource that white has. You play this move f3. Now the move that you want to play in reality is this move f4. However, there is a problem with f4, and that problem is bishop to g4, because if you take this bishop and then you lose your knight, you move the king, and what happens is that after h5 and h4, this is already a very dangerous attack for black, because this knight is coming to g3, and you're almost about to get checkmated here. Can't even play h3, because then you get forked, you lose your queen, for example, and this position is absolutely atrocious for the white pieces. So instead of playing a move like f4 in one go, what you should remember is to play f3, and this attacks the knight. Knight has to move, and then you play f4. So now you won a tempo, knight moved, you won a tempo again. Knight can go back to e6, or it can go back to e4, doesn't matter. We will continue with moves like bishop to e3, and then either knight c3 or knight to d2, so something like this. Let's say castles happens. Castles is not the most accurate move, but it is a very common move. You can play this move knight to d2, and you can get this type of a position where you are slightly better with the white pieces because of some other ideas that I'm going to talk about very, very soon. But for now, remember this resource of playing f3 and then f4. It can happen in different move orders. For example, if bishop to e7 is played, you still go f3. In this case, there's also knight to c5, but you can still play f4 in this position. And this is just a very, very nice way of winning a tempo with the white pieces. Okay, so you might have thought to yourself, okay, why do we want to play f3 and f4 in a position like this? Okay, we want a tempo, we got the pawn to f4, but why do we want to do this? That is because actually in a lot of these Scotch Gambit positions, we can start an early attack. And when I say early attack, I mean as soon as right now. We can go f5. We don't have to develop. We can actually start an attack immediately. We can go f5, say black plays a move like knight to e4, and then we go knight c3, captures, captures. And in this position, if f6 is played by black, we will go e6, and this is just atrocious for black. This bishop has to move once again, and now we go queen g4. We're threatening bishop to h6. We're threatening rook f3, rook g3, a rook lift to attack this king, and this position it's just game over from here. We have a winning attack, not to mention this pawn is also hanging. So black has to be extremely careful. Black cannot play a move like f6, and if black does, then you saw what happened. We go e6. Most likely black will try to attack and play in the center of the board, but if that's the case, we will play f6 ourselves, and here we're trying to open up our opponent's king. So let's say bishop to d8 is played because our opponent does not want to open up his king. Well, first of all, we will protect this pawn because this pawn was hanging, and then we're also threatening e5 here technically, so the queen has to move, and then we will go queen e1, transfer the queen over to the g3 square, and now we just need to be a little bit careful. We want to play this move queen g5 and then queen h6, but it doesn't work right away because of bishop takes f6, and you have to be very careful because your knight is hanging. So what you will do is you will just simply protect the knight, and then you will play queen to g5 on the next move with the idea of queen h6 and then queen g7 checkmate. Of course, black might try to stop this with moves like king to h8, queen h6, and then rook to g8. This only delays mate for a couple of moves. You can't really do a whole lot to defend this position. You can go bishop to g5 and then go rook to f4. For example, there's even a mating pattern like this. You play rook to f4, say black takes this pawn or whatever. You don't even have to play this move rook h4. It leads to checkmate, but what you can play is queen takes h7 right away and then rook to h4 checkmate. So I've had a couple of games where I played this queen sacrifice on h7 with rook h4 mate. So this is an idea that exists as well. But the main idea of this sort of a setup, let me go all the way back. The main idea of this setup when we have pawns on f4 and e5 is that we can start an early attack on black whenever they castle with moves like f5 and f6. Next idea that I want to talk about is to sacrifice this pawn on b2 for activity. So in a position like this, we go f3 and f4. We already talked about this. Bishop to e3, so we just continue developing a little bit. And queen to b8, a very clever move for the black pieces is to attack this pawn on b2 and go to b6 to pressure this diagonal in some positions. Now in a position like this, you can play this move b3 and then queen to b6 is going to be played, and we get a position like this. It is a very nice position for white. This is something you can play, but what I would recommend is to actually sacrifice this pawn on b2 and play knight to c3 instead. Now if the knight is taken and your pawns are doubled, this looks a little bit ugly, but the thing is you don't need to have a perfect structure on the queen side, since your plans are to attack on this side of the board. So you don't need a perfect structure over here. Your plans are actually over here near the king, so you don't need to have a perfect structure. And if this pawn is taken on b2, which is the main move, you basically go into sort of a not forced but a really dangerous sequence of moves. And when I say dangerous, I mean dangerous for black. Black has to be ultra precise in a lot of these lines, and if he is not, then basically what will happen here is that you will play rook to d1, you will play rook d2, and you get a lot of activity for your sacrificed pawn. And as a matter of fact, black is up 2 pawns here, so we sacrificed 2 pawns, but look at those 2 extra pawns. The 2 extra pawns for black are the double isolated pawns on c6 and c7. I mean, that's really not that big of a deal. And as a matter of fact, this position is winning for white if you play this move f5, because after you play this move f5, this bishop ends up on d5, and you just continue with your typical Scotch Gambit attack with f6, queen to g5, and then queen h6. Go for a checkmating attack on this king. If g6, queen h6 already leads to checkmate. So this is an extremely dangerous position for the black pieces, and there's really not much black can do at this point. He probably has to like go back to c8, and then you play f6 anyways,
and this is how the play should continue. But it's still it's an atrocious position. Like the only way to try to defend this is if queen g5 is played, you have this resource of queen g4, which is a very clever resource. So you have to be a little bit careful. You have to sort of slow play this position with moves like rook to d4 and then rook e4 and stuff like that, for example. And this is still going to be winning for white as long as you're precise. But all of this happened because we sacrificed the pawn on b2, and it is a very, very interesting line that you should keep in mind, and you have the option to sacrifice this pawn. That's what I'm trying to show you. You don't have to. If you want to play b3, you can play b3. However, the option for sacrificing this pawn is there, and you get a lot of activity and a lot of attacking possibilities in return. Another important idea that you should remember is that in Scotch Gambit, most of the time you want to look for a counter-attack rather than actually defend the position. And this is sort of a general concept, but it still applies very well in this opening, and I'm going to show you what I mean by this. So we're going to get not knight e4, but knight d7 here, which is a slightly different line, but we get a very similar sequence of moves. And in a position like this, after knight takes on e5, let's say, we have bishop to f4, and let's say knight to g6 is played. Now, in a position like this, a lot of people would autopilot play this move bishop to g3, which is wrong because black now defends the pawn and you're just down a pawn, and this is going to be dangerous. Maybe not c5 right away, but probably, yeah, black can play c5 like you play rook to e1, castles, knight to c3, you're going to get hit with c5. So this is not a very pleasant position to be dealing with, but what you want to do instead of playing moves like bishop f4, you want to always be looking at counter-attacking resources. So instead of dropping the bishop back, you actually want to go forward. You want to take this pawn, and then you want to take on e7 again. And if knight e7 is played, well, okay, this is totally fine. You're just going to continue with rook to e1, and the game goes on from here. You have a very nice bishop on f4. You have a more active position. However, if bishop on f4 is taken instead, now after rook to e1, all of a sudden, this king is in a bit of a trouble. And what do you do here? You have to play a move like king to f8, and then after knight takes c8, rook takes c8, queen f3, you get a very active position. Once again, king to f8 has been played, so it's not exactly winning right away, but the position is +1 after king f8. This is just very uncomfortable for black, and now you have to try to add some pressure, add pressure, and then you will find a breakthrough. So in positions like these, you never want to defend. You always want to be looking at counter-attacking resources. I will show you one more example of that. If instead of taking a move like knight to b8 is played, you will go knight to c3, c5, knight d to b5, a6, let's say. You don't want to retreat this knight to a3. Yeah, it's a retreating move, it's a defensive move, but you, as I said, you always want to be looking at counter-attacking resources. Queen takes d5, hitting the rook in the corner, and if the queen takes on d5, now we go knight c7 check, and we take back this queen this way. And from here, you are up 2 pawns, and this is just a very, very winning position for the white pieces. Idea number 6 is going to be the fact that this pawn on f7 is very, very soft, and you can actually get a lot of tactical opportunities on it. So for example, we already looked at knight f6 lines. Let's see what happens when black plays bishop to c5. And if they play bishop to c5, you have a couple of options here. As I said, you can play knight g5, or you can play what I like to play, and that is c3. And after c3, if this pawn is taken on c3, this already almost loses for black on the spot. After bishop takes f7, king takes f7, you have queen d5, and you can take this bishop, but it's actually good to throw in this check, bait out g6 because it weakens the dark square diagonal, and then take this bishop on c5. And let's say if black takes this pawn on b2, you will take back, and this is just an atrocious position for the black pieces, because right now you are technically down in terms of, like, you're down 1 point of material, you're down a pawn. But the thing is, your position is so active here. All your pieces are fantastic. Black has dark square weaknesses that this position is extremely good for the black pieces. Black can't even castle because black already moved the king, and also the queen is here. So black is just simply unable to castle in these positions. And you get very nice attacking ideas such as rook e1 and e5. Basically, things that we've already seen. We want to open up the e-file and we want to attack this king on e8. So what you have to remember is that in a lot of these lines, f7 is extremely soft and you have sacrifices like bishop takes f7. And on the topic of f7, there's another idea here, and that is that queen on d5 is very good at attacking this pawn on f7. And oftentimes, let's say bishop to b4 is played, you go c3, takes. Again, you have multiple options, and I'm not going to go through all the options. This video is not for me to like go through every single line. I'm just showing you the lines that I personally like playing, that I find to be very effective. So my favorite response here is to go with b takes c3, and let's say this bishop retreats back to this square on e7, because if this bishop goes to c5, we already looked at this. This is a very similar sequence. We take on f7 and then we go queen d5. But again, if the bishop goes back to e7 and we go queen d5 here anyways, nobody can guard this pawn on f7. The game is just over because you have to go knight to h6 to guard it. Okay, we just simply remove the defender tactic. This is checkmate. So what black has to do is probably just give up the knight, and then this is of course completely winning for the white pieces. So you have this queen d5 resource in moments where this bishop ends up on e7, and it's very important to wait for this bishop to go to e7 before you play queen d5, because if you play queen d5 at an incorrect moment, for example right now, queen d5 is simply not going to work because of queen e7, and both of these are defended at the same time. So this queen has to not have the option of going to e7, but when the bishop is on e7, that's exactly the case. The queen cannot go to e7, so you get this sort of a tactical shot on this square on f7 once again. So remember to play queen d5 to attack this pawn on f7 whenever the bishop blocks the queen's path. Idea number 8 is going to be one of the most important ideas in this video, so I want you to pay close attention right now. There can be potential outposts on this c5 square. For example, in a lot of lines, say you play this move c3 and knight f6 is played, and you go into a sequence like this, for example, which is very similar to what we looked at. It's not exactly the same, it's a slightly different move order, but something like this can easily happen in your games. You played e5 and then you took the pawn back and you get a position like this. So what tends to happen in these types of positions is that after a bunch of exchanges, usually this knight is going to be taken by this bishop on b5. And when that happens, you have to remember that this square on c5 becomes very, very weak, and it is an outpost for this knight on f3. And if you land the knight on c5, and especially if black has the light square bishop left and all the other pieces, all the other minor pieces have been traded off, we're going to get a good knight versus a bad bishop scenario. So for example, let's say rook to b8, knight d3, bishop f5, knight c5. This is a dark square outpost. This is a light square bishop. This bishop will never be able to challenge this knight on c5. So a potential outpost always exists on c5, and that is something you always have to watch out for whenever this trade happens. So that means that in lots of positions like these, you not only have the option of attacking the king, you also have this option of playing a bit more positionally, or you can even combine the two. You can put the knight on c5 and then still go f4, f5. You have option to do both, and you have option to attack multiple sides of the board. And I just think that that's like one of the coolest ideas. If a move like bishop to f5 is played, preventing the knight from getting to d3 and getting to c5, you're gonna have enough time to attack this pawn and to put a lot of pressure on this pawn with moves like you're still gonna go knight d3 and you're still going to get sequences like this. But even if you don't get the knight to c5, you can build up tremendous pressure on the c file. You can still continue to attack over here. So you combine multiple ideas here. You combine the threat of attacking the king, and you combine the threat of getting a very dominant knight on c5. So you have to combine positional play with attacking ideas, and that's how you play these positions. Now I want to talk about a very interesting idea that you have in these types of positions, and that is that your opponent's bishop, when it ends up on the a5 square with a move sequence like this one, for example, the bishop on a5 is actually very, very uncomfortable. So in a position like this, we already looked at bishop c5, we have bishop takes f7. If bishop goes back to e7, we have queen d5 winning the game. And the thing is that bishop a5 is the only good move for black. But in a weird way, it's actually still very uncomfortable to play a move like bishop to a5. The reason why it's uncomfortable is because after, let's say, castles and knight f6 is played, you can play moves like bishop to a3, and you can play moves like e5, and then you can go queen to b3. So you're trying to open everything up over here, and because this bishop is on a5, the knight cannot go to a5, which means that queen b3 is a very, very good resource that white has in these positions. The way to counter queen b3 is with knight a5, because that would be a fork of the bishop and the queen. And then, of course, black would trade off the knight for the bishop, and then black would be fine. But because of the fact that this bishop is on a5, it creates a lot of problems for the black pieces. And as a matter of fact, the best move after you castle, after bishop to a5 and castles, the best move here is not to go knight f6 or even to go d6. The best move here is to retreat the bishop back to b6 immediately, because you want to free up this square and you want to make sure that this bishop does not get in the knight's way. However, in a lot of lines where this bishop ends up being on b6, it actually ends up becoming somewhat of a target. And the thing is, the most theoretically played move in this position is bishop to a3. But the move that I really like is actually this move a4. I think this move is very interesting. And after a4, the thing is, if you just simply play some silly moves, what tends to happen here is that in a lot of these positions, you can play moves like bishop to a3, and now we see the idea of having this pawn on a4. We can play a5 in this position, and actually, as a matter of fact, taking this pawn on a5 is very bad for black, because we take on c5, and then bishop to b6 has to be played, and then we basically keep our bishop on this diagonal where it's very uncomfortable for the black pieces. Black cannot castle, and black cannot easily get rid of this bishop right here without giving something back in return. So this is an extremely dangerous position for black, and with this move a4 in a lot of lines, as I said, a5 becomes a possibility, and we are able to get rid of this bishop in a lot of these lines. So let me go back and show you one more example of what can happen if instead of a move like d6, let's say knight to e7 is played instead. Even in lines like this, you go knight to g5 hitting this pawn. Black cannot castle because of queen h5. So same tactical pattern that we saw earlier. We are threatening checkmate. It has to be defended. We take on f7. We got a monstrous attack on this f7 pawn. So in this case, castles cannot be played. Knight to e5 has to be played. But now we go bishop takes f7 anyways. And this might look weird because after knight takes f7, knight f7, king f7, aren't we just losing here with white? Well, not so fast. Remember, we played this move a4. Now we can play a5. We can hit this bishop, and as it turns out, this bishop is trapped, right? Because you cannot take the pawn. You will lose the bishop. You cannot go to d4. You cannot go to e3. You cannot go to f2. So you have to go to c5, only square. But look at this. Whoops. Now you just lose your bishop. Knight g6, queen takes c5. Now this a4, a5 move is very, very clever, and you have tactical opportunities like this. That's why I like this move a4 quite a lot, all the way back here. So remember that bishop on b6 is a target, and you can actually target it with moves like a4 and then a5 at an opportune moment. There is one last line that I wanted to show you, and that is this move d6. Now, we already looked at knight f6, we looked at bishop c5, we looked at some bishop to b4 check ideas, but we haven't looked at this move d6, and that's because it's not a very good move. And what I want you to remember is that in these types of positions, you don't necessarily need to remember all the moves by heart. You need to know the ideas and plans. So after d6, you will capture this pawn on d4, and if they go knight f6, you will defend the pawn, of course. And what tends to happen in these positions is that you can go bishop to f4 right away, or you can castle. Again, I don't want you to remember all the moves by heart. What I want you to remember are the ideas. So after castles, you can do a couple of different things. You can put the bishop on f4, you can play moves like h3, for example, and you can do lots of different things. You can go rook to e1 and so on. But the most testing way to play is to put the bishop on f4 in these types of positions. And in a lot of cases, let's say a move like knight to e5 is played. You drop the bishop back to b3 or e2. These are both reasonable options. And then what you want to do is you want to play h3, and you want to drop this bishop back to g3 and then play f4. So let's say opponent plays a move like a5. Well, you kind of have to stop this, but let's say we get a situation like this. We can either go to g3, or in this case, since queen b6 was played, we can go to e3 as well. But the main idea is that we're trying to play for f4 here. And that's very important, because with f4, we take a lot of control with our pieces. We will go queen to f3, let's say rook to e8. You're going to go to either d1 or e1. These are both reasonable options. d1 makes a bit more sense because you are going to be able to target this pawn in the future. And basically what you're going to do is you're going to slowly improve your position. So you're going to go bishop f2, maybe bring the bishop over here. All of these pawns over here are protected, and this pawn is potentially weak. And if black dares to break out with a move like d5, for example, you can always play this move e5. And once you play e5, now you have tremendous amounts of attacking opportunities with these two pawns. Actually, the position is so strong that you can even play a move like knight takes d5 right now, sacrificing the knight for this pawn on d5. You want to go knight to b5 afterwards. You're going to win this pawn back. This pawn's not really going anywhere, and then you're going to have tremendous attacking possibilities with ideas like e6 down the road. Of course, you cannot play f5 immediately. You would lose this pawn. But the thing is, black doesn't have moves. Black cannot do anything. Let's say rook to a6 is played. You have bishop takes f7. You have queen d5. And this is just an atrocious position for the black pieces. Black is completely lost here. So you can get these types of games, and you gotta remember the ideas. You don't need to remember specific moves, because these types of structures and these types of positions can be achieved from many different move orders, but you have to remember the ideas. So for example, in this case, black might not play a5 at all. Black might play rook to e8. In this case, you want to drop the bishop back, and black might play queen c7, but your plans are about the same. You want to drop this bishop to either g3 or e3. You want to play f4. Ideally, you would like to have this bishop on g3 and not on e3, but the idea is that you want to go queen f3, you want to go rook d1, you want to build up pressure on the d file, you want to build up pressure on the f file, you want to build up pressure on f7, and this is just an extremely dangerous position for the black pieces. Black is almost busted already. And all of this happened because d6 was played. So after d6 is played, what you have to remember is that strategically, from a purely strategic point of view, this blocks the bishop, right? Because the bishop on f8 is now blocked out of this diagonal. And what you can do from here on out is control d5. If you're able to successfully control d5, this bishop will stay passive for a very long time, which will allow you attacking opportunities with f4 and then e5 at the correct moment.
Now I'm going to show you an example of a successful Scotch Gambit. Ray Robson is playing with the white pieces against Hans Niemann with black. So in this case, Ray Robson starts out with e4. We get an Italian, but after knight to f6, it immediately transposes back into the Scotch Gambit. The thing about this position and the thing about Scotch Gambit is that you can get this opening from a couple of different move orders. So you can get multiple move orders, but they all transpose into one another. So we get Scotch Gambit by transposition, and then after e5, d5, bishop to b5. These are all lines that we already looked at in this video, so I'm not going to go into detail right now. Bishop to e7 line chosen by Hans, f3, knight to c5, and then bishop to e3. So in this case, Ray Robson does not play this move f4. He chooses bishop to e3 instead, developing this bishop. Now, the pawn being on f3 has a very important positional benefit, and that is that it just simply does not allow the knight to go back to e4. That's the whole reason why we played f3, was to kick out the knight. Now, after we kick out the knight though, and castles by black, knight to c3, knight to e6 chosen by Hans, Ray takes, black takes, and then knight to a4. And now you see the versatility of the Scotch Gambit opening, and that is that you don't necessarily have to go for a kingside attack. You can play on the queen side, and we talked about the idea earlier, right? Potential outposts on c5 exist. You can put something on c5 and it could become an outposted piece. So that's a very important thing that you have to remember. You don't necessarily have to force an attack. You can play positionally as well. So knight to c5 chosen by white, and then bishop to f5 captures, and then c3 chosen by Ray, blunting this bishop right here. Queen to e7, queen d2, both sides just simply developing here. Nothing interesting going on just yet. This knight went out to b7 to attack the queen. It is going to come back in just a move. Yeah, you see that right there. And then bishop to d4 chosen by Ray. This is an excellent move because when you play a move like bishop to d4, you offer the trade and exchange of dark square bishops. And even though your pawn ends up isolated on d4, this structure right here is excellent for the white pieces because you actually open up the c file, you open up potential lines of attack towards these pawns right here in the future. Not to mention you reinforce the square on c5, so now this is a proper outpost and we have a proper good knight versus a bad bishop scenario. So in a situation like this, if you're trying to win with the white pieces, you would like to trade off one pair of rooks and potentially trade off queens as well. If you're able to leave rooks and bishop versus knight on the board, that's going to be winning for white most likely. Even knight versus bishop by itself is going to be a much better end game. However, black might have some chances of drawing if the rooks are still not on the board. So queen to f4 chosen by Hans, and then a3, rook to e8, rook to d1. Again, both sides just simply bringing the pieces into the game. Queen g3 offering a queen trade. Here you cannot take with the rook because there's queen d4. That would be very bad. You have to take with the queen, and then queen to d2 chosen by Ray, queen to h4, rook e1, rook e8, captures, and then queen e3, both sides simply improving their pieces. And now queen e5 centralizing the queen, hitting this bishop and also hitting the pawn on c7. So there are multiple things that are under attack here. Queen g5, you have to defend the bishop, of course, as black. And then h4, excellent move by Ray, because what this does is that it tries to deflect the queen off of the defense of the bishop. Of course, the pawn cannot be taken because you lose the bishop with a check. But the thing about h4 is that it creates a getaway square for the king. So if you're ever checked over here, you can always run to h2. So this is another very important benefit of h4. So queen to g6 chosen by Hans. Queen c7, he couldn't defend everything, so he had to give up the pawn. And then king to h2 by Ray, and then he picks up yet another pawn because there are no good checks. There's this check on d6, which Hans goes for, but after a simple g3, you cannot really do anything. What's funny is that after g3, it looks like the second rank is very weak. If this queen could teleport to e2, this would be very dangerous for white. But the thing is, the queen has no way to get to e2 because this square is covered by the white.
queen, this square is covered by the knight, and this square is covered by the pawn. So all three of these squares are covered, and queen simply does not have access to e2. So that's why you can afford to play moves like this. And after queen f8 here, knight e6 was played. The pawn cannot be taken because the queen takes g7 would be checkmate in one move. And after a move like queen to f6, queen b8, knight to d8, this king is now getting hunted out, and then bishop to a4. I mean, the position is already lost. There's not much you can do with black in this position. So I guess Hans was just trying to protect the pawn, but the thing is, it's the position's so lost that you can't really do a whole lot. So knight to e6, g5 was attempted by Hans en passant, and after king takes g6, this is just simply checkmate after queen to g4. So this is a very, very nice game by Ray Robson, an extremely well played Scotch Gambit game, and it just goes to show you the versatility of this opening. He went for this square on c5. So what happened in this game was that Ray Robson didn't go for an early attack. He made sure to blockade this square on c5, and then later on he made the right exchanges, because here bishop to f4 is a beneficial exchange for white, significantly beneficial. You open up lines of sight towards the opponent's pawns. You trade off one of the pieces that can potentially challenge this knight on c5, and Hans took on d4. And the thing is, this position is just very, very difficult to defend. It's such a sad position. You're not trying to win this position with black. You're trying to hold on for dear life, but it's a really difficult position, and Hans ended up losing. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you play Scotch Gambit, and I hope you win many, many games with it. And let me know in the comments down below if my videos help you win games in these openings. So if you win games in the Scotch Gambit, definitely let me know in the comments. I would love to hear your testimonials of how you're destroying your opponents with the openings that I teach you. I enjoy reading your comments. So that's going to be it for today. I will see you in the next one. Peace.